It's Friday evening. I'm Paul Ducklin from Naked Security at Sophos, and today's topic, as you can see, it relates to an article that you may already have read on nakedsecurity.sophos.com. It's tips for tightening up your working from home network. Now, we're not doing this particular topic because it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, although, of course, as we mentioned last week, it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so it's a good time to do it, but any time is a good time to start thinking about tightening up security, particularly as many countries are having what you might call a secondary lockdown, and people who thought they might be able to go back to work may end up working from home for a lot longer than they thought. Oh, there's just people watching. I presume if you couldn't hear, you would have said, I can't hear. So I shall proceed as usual. So I don't have an exploit or a story or a vulnerability or a technical thing to explain to you today. So I'm not going to promise that will make this shorter, because every time I promise to try and be briefer than usual, I end up being even longer. But I'm just going to plough straight in with some tips on, given that you're working from home, assuming that you are, whether you're self-employed now or were self-employed all along, or whether you're working for somebody who sent you home and said you have to work from home, I imagine that at least some of the need to do IT and get cybersecurity right, even for your work computing, now falls on you. And of course, because you're sharing your work and your home network, then it kind of means that things are a little bit mixed up. So if work are pressurizing you, look, you need to be secure, you need to take security seriously. If it's important for you in your work life, then you can imagine, just think about the fact that means it's really important for you in your home life as well, whether they mix or not. So let's start at the beginning. The first thing that I recommend you do for your home network, and I'm assuming that for most of us that means an internet connection, which might be fiber, it might be ADSL, it might be through a mobile phone line, but it probably has some kind of connection which enters your house or your flat or the building you live in, and it ends up in a wireless router that has Wi-Fi in it, and that's probably how you get most of your connections throughout your home. And you probably have a whole lot of stuff connected to that. You certainly, if you're working from home, would have your work laptop connected to it. You probably have your phone. Maybe you have your partner or your spouse, your SO, they also have a phone. Maybe you've got kids, they might have phones and tablets and other devices connected. You might have a smart TV, you might have a home thermostat, you might have a smart electricity meter, all sorts of stuff. You might have a voice assistant, all sorts of things that you've accumulated over the years that when you get them home and look at them, they say, for this device to work, you need to connect it up to your home network so it can call home and do all the great things that it's going to do from you. Now remember, you're now sharing that home network with your work computer, and in theory, don't want to overstate the dangers here, but the problem is when you're on the home network compared to when you're at work, if there's a device, some little device, it could be a webcam, it could be a smart thermostat, it could be just some toy that you connect up to the internet for your kids every now and then that's a good bit of fun, or automated vacuum cleaner or something. If one of those devices has a vulnerability that a crook can exploit so that they're able to run network commands on that device that's inside your network, it's almost as though the crooks have invited themselves into, if you like, the pound seat right next to your computer. And the next best thing for a crook who wants to attack, say, your work laptop, the next best thing to having malware on your computer where they can interact directly with it, is to be on a computer that's right next to yours on the network. In other words, there are no routers, there are no firewalls, there's no ISP, there's no VPN in the way, there's just your computer, a wireless cloud, and another device on the same network. So tip number one for tidying up, if you like, tightening up or tidying up your home network is find out, enumerate, think about all those devices that you've got and ask yourself, do I really need it online? Because there's bound to be something on there that you probably don't need anymore. And although it doesn't sound as though you're going to increase your security much by removing it, you might as well. Because the one way to prevent crooks jumping in and hacking into a device on your network, if it's insecure, is not to have the device on the network in the first place. So if you had an old home thermostat and now you've got a new one, make sure you've removed the old one. And if you have a voice assistant and you like to use it, maybe you sit around with the kids and you say, hey, I'm not going to mention a name, because if I say the words or too loudly, it might set yours off. You might have a device that you want to mess around with your kids, but when you go to bed, do you really need that thing left on? Probably not. So actually a really simple kind of ultimate firewall is the power plug. If you plug it out of the wall, power the device down. If you don't need it, don't connect it. So it sounds like a very basic tip, but it's simplifying your digital life or simplifying your network means there are fewer things, unexpected things that can happen to you if something goes wrong. The second thing, for any device that you bring in that you're going to add onto your network, whether it's your work laptop or a mobile phone that your wife or your husband or your partner bought, or a phone that you got for your kids, or just some device that you want to bring in like a webcam and try it out, what you need to do before you go online, make sure you know how to update the thing. Now, on Naked Security, we had some commenters saying, oh, I can't even persuade my users to take passwords seriously. I tell them they have to have a 12-character password and they just go password 2020. Like, they're never going to be able to learn step 2 of yours, tip 2 of yours, learn how to update stuff. To be honest, it's not that difficult. Most people, when you buy a new refrigerator, you kind of can work out where the settings are, what makes it hot and cold, how you adjust it, which things go where, which parts of it are cooler. It doesn't take long to work out how it works, to work out how to keep it clean, to work out how to get the best and most hygienic performance out of it. Seriously, if you can do it with a refrigerator or white goods like a washing machine, you can definitely do it with smart devices that you connect online. These days, manufacturers, under pressure of legislation in some parts of the world, are getting better about having options on their device or documented that allow you to go online and get updates. So check how you get them, and before you make the device live, go and bring it up to date, because if there are bugs in the device as it's sitting on the shelf, don't connect it up, because the crooks, if they're old bugs that have already been patched, the crooks already know how to attack them. So do you need it in the first place? If you do, bring it up to date. And then the next thing I recommend, tip number 3, is before you commit to using the device, learn how to configure it. So for example, if I buy myself a new wireless router, I bought a few in my time, what I'll do is I'll bring it home, I'll power it up, read through the blurb, and I'll connect it to my laptop, but not yet to the internet. And I'll work out from the manual or from first principles, I'll log in, I'll see what the password is and learn how to change it, and I'll take myself through all the, normally when you think of a web router or lots of devices, they've got a little web interface and it's got a whole load of tabs and a whole load of options. Take yourself through all of those. Make notes if you like. It's okay even to write them down. Buy some index cards if you like. So learn how to configure it and what options are available. Because while you're doing that, firstly, you will learn about default settings, those pre-configured settings that you might later wish to change because you think they're too liberal. And you might learn about settings that you could turn on that are there for people who want to be more secure, but the manufacturer just doesn't turn them on by default. So go through and make sure that when you're thinking about the device, you know what features it supports, but most importantly, in an emergency, you know how to get in and switch those things on and off. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, 5, 10 or 20 minutes, just practicing how to use the device before you actually fire it up for real in the first time. That way, if you suddenly need to go and say, oh, I need to turn off this thing or I need to change that password, it doesn't take you an hour and a half to go through and find out where to make the changes. Make your mistakes, your configuration mistakes, your forced resets if you need to do them before you make the thing live, and you will not disappoint yourself. So having done those first 3 tips, do I really need it? Have I brought it up to date? And if I turn it on, if I make it live, do I know how to configure it? Then, based on what you learned by looking through the configuration interface on that device, whether it's a router or a webcam or a GoPro or whatever it is, then you need to decide for yourself, are there any default settings which either I can see on the internet people are recommending that I change, that I know from my own reading that I ought to change, or that the manufacturer, when I log in, is actually saying, please change these things first. And the obvious ones that you need to look for in many devices, whether they're routers or webcams or whatever, firstly, if there are default passwords, administrator passwords, believe me, the crooks know all of those. You can go on the internet and download yourself a list of every default password for every Internet of Things device ever made in about 5 or 10 minutes. The crooks know your password if there's a default and you don't change it. So go and change them before you make the device live. The other thing that many devices have troubleshooting options, and they're often turned on by default to help you when you're setting it up so you can't lock yourself out by mistake. And those are things particularly for something like a router remote access. It allows someone outside, like then you can call up your friend on a phone and say, oh, connect into my router and help me, I'm stuck. The problem is if your router's open to the outside world, it's also open to the crooks, and you probably don't want that. And another thing, just specifically for routers, there is a feature that many routers and devices have called universal plug and play. It's designed to help your device and other devices on your network find each other automatically. It is rather dangerous because it can accidentally expose internal devices to the outside. So that's another thing. If it's on by default, learn where the configuration is, turn it off before you start. So now we've got 4 tips. Do I really need it? Have I brought it up to date? Do I know how to configure it? And having learned how to configure it, what should I change, particularly passwords and remote access stuff, before I make it live for the first time? And the last thing that you need to check, you might not check immediately, but you might learn later, and since you know how to configure the device, presumably you can adjust these settings. Make sure you know for any device that you bring in, whether it's a smart meter or a webcam or a automatic vacuum cleaner, what data is it sharing back home? Most vendors these days will tell you what they're sharing, they will let you know, and unfortunately what some of them do is say, because we've told you, we've set it to the max, so we're going to take everything we can. A good example, now these don't go on your regular network, so this is not quite part of tidying up your working from home network. But for example, in the United Kingdom, if you have a smart electricity meter, now it doesn't go on your network, but it does have several modes of sharing. And the default is, as I understand it, is that every half an hour it will share data about your energy consumption back with your supplier. The idea is then they can identify times of the day when you're using more power, and they can maybe suggest to you, you know what, if you're doing washing at 4 p.m, if you switch to doing it 11 p.m, then A, you'll wake up your neighbours, but B, you'll save a lot of money. The thing is, you may be happy with that. That's maybe what you want. But there is an option that says share my power usage, so it just knows how much to charge you only once a day. And lots of devices have these levels of settings. You can understand why vendors who can make marketing capital out of data that you provide them willingly, why they want to have the default set to share as much as possible. Make sure you know what those are, and never ever feel squeezed for whatever reason it is. Oh, you're going to help England be greener, or whatever the reason is. If you're not comfortable with sharing that amount of data and the law doesn't require you to do so, then you are quite entitled to dial back, and as long as you know from tip 3 how to configure the device, you can go and do all that pretty easily. So now we're at 5 tips. I'll run through them again because they all, as you can see, go together. Do I really need it? If I do and I'm going to put online, have I brought it up to date so it doesn't have any of the ills of the past with it? Do I know how to configure it so I can change settings that might be wrong, either in advance or in an emergency if I need to fix things for security? Are there any default settings like passwords that I ought to have changed before I make it live? And am I aware what this device is sharing back with other people, and am I comfortable with that? If you are, excellent. If you're not, because of step 3, you know how to configure it, go and change it. So those are the key 5 tips. You can see I haven't said, oh, you go to this button and you click this thing and you change this option, like I did when I said get Windows to show you file extensions, and you go to File Explorer, View, File Extensions, and it's exactly the same for everybody using Windows 10. The same sequence will work. The problem is, for home internet devices, like for every webcam, for every home router, for every mobile phone, every vendor's a little bit smarter and cleverer and cooler than every other. So no two are exactly the same. And that's why I'm not giving you specific thing, go here, click that button. I'm saying explore the configuration menus, make notes of what's where, because what you see may be different even from a friend of yours who bought a similar device maybe a month earlier or a month later. There might be subtle changes. So that's why here I'm just giving you very, if you like, almost vague idea of what to go and look for, research for yourself so you know what to do. So the next 2 tips, a little bit more specific, but they're quite useful, and these are settings that you can go and make on your working from home network in your home router. Now, not all home routers have these. If they don't, it doesn't mean you're doomed, but if your router supports these features, you may want to use them. So these are two slightly more specific tips. Number 6 is a thing that I call divide and conquer. You famously know that Julius Caesar said all Gaul is divided into 3 parts. He felt it was easier to administer if he didn't have it as one big province. He split into bits so that he could keep control of his empire better. That was the theory. Was it omnis Gallia in tres partes est divisa? So you can do that with many wireless networks these days. You go into your router and look around for, it might be called guest Wi-Fi, it might be called secondary Wi-Fi, it might be called setup wireless networks. Many routers these days actually let you run essentially 2 access points out of one router. So you can have 2 different networks with different MAC addresses, with different names, with different passwords and different security settings. And that way you could set up a network that where you just put your work devices on, like your work laptop, and you take all the free-for-all, the kids' toys and your home mobile phones and stick them on another part of your wireless network. It's not perfect. If a crook can hack your router, obviously they can change that setting or make the packets join. But generally speaking, it's almost as though you've created yourself 2 networks, but you don't need to go out and buy 2 internet connections or 2 mobile phones or 2 routers. A lot of routers do let you do this divide and conquer, and it can be quite a convenient way. It means if a friend comes around, if they're still allowed to in your part of the world, and say, I want to jump on your network, you don't have to let them onto the part of the network where your work laptop is. You can just let them use the bit where all your other, if you like, your more free-for-all part of your network is. And the 7th tip, another thing that many routers have these days, it's usually called something like client isolation, but you might have to search around to find out what the equivalent is for your router. Many routers have it. Basically what it does is it turns your wireless access point into what's more like a network switch than a network bridge or a network hub. So it's not a perfect solution, but the idea is that if you run a network sniffer or if you peek around on the local network, the only device that everybody sees is the router. Now that may not work. You may want to be able to communicate between devices on your network, so you may not be able to use this option, but it can be quite useful. Most coffee shops these days, you'll notice, will do that. Like if you're a bit naughty and you start a wireless network sniffer in the average coffee shop these days, you'll see loads of network traffic, and when you dig into it, you'll go, oh, it's all mine. And the reason is they don't want people spying on each other, so they've turned on this feature. It's very easy to do, and remember tip 3, you've learned how to configure your router. So client isolation is a very, very handy feature. And the 8th tip for us to finish up is that if you are working from home and you have the good fortune to be working for a company that does have an IT department that is trying to do its best to help you in these tricky WFH times, make sure you know whom you're supposed to talk to if something does go wrong or if you need advice. Don't leave it until there's a crisis and then start phoning around or trying to contact a zillion different people. And take the trouble, do your IT department the favour of finding out that if you needed to contact them, for example, if you were locked out of this or you forgot your password for that or you thought a crook had got into your network in this, that and the other way, what information right off the bat would they expect you to provide to start with? Because that way it means if you do need to ask them, you can get them working on the problem much faster than if you have to ask them what they want to ask you, wait for them to ask it back, provide a bit of information, have a whole load of back and forth or sort of network terms round trips before you can actually begin to go. So do a little bit of homework, invest a little bit of your time to make their time easier. And there's a sort of, to finish off, there is, if you like, a tip 8B, which is the flip side of IT departments and getting people to contact them. If you're in the IT department and you want people to help you and you want to try and make your staff, whether they're working in the office or working from home, if you want to help them become the eyes and the ears of the office IT cybersecurity team, then make it easy for them to report stuff. And if people aren't quite sure, report things that you can see straight away, well, it's a little bit of a false alarm, or they probably should have realised there was nothing to worry about. Don't get too shirty with them, because try and treat it that when people are trying to do the right thing and report problems to you, try and treat it as though there's never any such thing as a stupid question, only a stupid answer. Because my experience is that no matter how ill-informed people might be about cybersecurity, most users at most companies, actually, particularly if they're working from home, they actually want to learn more about cybersecurity. They actually want to do the right thing. They don't want to get the company into trouble. They don't want to lose their job. And most importantly, because they're on the same network as their home life, they don't want to get hacked, because it doesn't just affect business, it doesn't just affect their work, it affects them at home. So most people want to do the right thing. Try and help them to do it. So one last time, a quick whiz through them all, folks, and then I will leave you be. Devices at home, you've got your network, you're working from home, you think, well, I wonder if that webcam is putting me at risk. Well, firstly, know what you've got. Find out the devices that you have that you may have forgotten about, that you connected up ages ago, and if you don't need them, then disconnect them. And if you don't need them on all the time, you're allowed to turn them off. And often, for many devices, if they don't have a battery, just unplugging them from the wall is enough. For devices you do want to use, keep them up to date. It does require a little bit of research to find out how for many devices, but manufacturers are making it easier and easier. They're under much more pressure to provide updates regularly when needed. And if there are updates, why on earth would you want to be behind where the crooks already are? You might as well get ahead of them, because it's a great way of benefiting yourself. So you've got a device, you need it, it's up to date. Make sure you know how it works. In the same way that I'm sure when you move into a new property, I always do if I get a new flat or move to a new house, the first thing I do is I go and make sure, where is the water stop tap and does it work? And I turn it off and back on. Yes, it works. Where do I isolate the gas? Where's the electricity meter? How do I turn off the power if I absolutely need to? All of that stuff. If you find it out in advance, then when the proverbial hits the whatever, then you don't have to go and find out while you're in a little bit of a panic. It becomes second nature. Just like fire alarms that teach you how to go down the stairs and out of the emergency door. It's much easier to do it when you're not under pressure. And while you're doing all of that, you should discover what configuration options are available for the devices you're using. And so explore the configuration interface so you know what can be turned on and off, and that will also help you figure out what needs to be turned off, which brings us to the last of those first 5 tips, and that is, before you make a new device live, make sure you have turned off or on or changed any settings that you know are either a bad idea or that you know you do not want. In particular, for things like routers, remote access you probably don't want, universal plug and play you probably don't want, and default passwords you definitely don't want if there are any, because if you know them because you can read them off the manual that everyone's got that's on the internet, the crooks know them too. Then 2 specific tips that you can do with your router that can help a little bit, and they're kind of free of charge if you like, if your router supports them. Divide and conquer, which is where you set up a guest network and then you put all the happy-go-lucky devices on that Wi-Fi and your work devices on the other Wi-Fi. It's basically a way of having 2 semi-separate networks without having to buy 2 of everything, get 2 internet connections, 2 routers, etc. And I mentioned client isolation, that's normally the term used, and basically the help text you might see in your router's menu, it'll say something like, do not allow devices to communicate directly, or do not allow devices to see each other directly on the network. And in fact, if you know how to do network scans, generally if you turn that on, when you scan the network, as you turn it on, you'll notice that all the other devices except yours and the router can magically disappear from the network. So it means if the crooks do get in, it's not perfect, but it does mean they can't just map out your whole network and know exactly what it looks like instantaneously without doing any more hacking at all. And lastly, if you are working from home for a company that provides an IT department and IT support, make sure that you don't waste their time, that if you do need to connect them, you know what to say before you call or email. Provide as much reasonable information as you can, because believe me, if you've ever worked in tech support, you'll know this. There's always a class of users, sadly it's usually a small minority, that when they make a request they stick in a whole load of information, usually not too much, but the kind of stuff that for other users you have to go back and ask them one by one. And when you can provide that all in advance, by golly, it makes their job much easier, which means they can help you faster, and in a real emergency they can help the next guy faster too. So thanks for listening, folks. I will finish with one last thing. This is not a tip, it's just a suggestion. If you're technically inclined, or you have a technically inclined chum who can help you along, and you have a spare virtual machine or a spare computer, for example, an old laptop, Sophos XG Firewall Home Edition is 100% free. And you can use that at home, so you could plug it in behind the wireless router, particularly if it's one that your ISP forces you to use. You can plug it, basically you are getting the full Sophos XG Firewall experience, but for home use it's free. And that doesn't just include antivirus, web filtering and the traditional firewall stuff. It also includes a VPN, so you can have your own VPN if you wanted for your family, email filtering and a whole lot of other stuff besides. So if you go to nakedsecurity.sophos.com, you'll find links to our free tools in every article. Go and have a look. It is an industrial grade firewall, so it doesn't quite set itself up. On the other hand, if you want to learn about firewalls, then please feel free to try the firmware for ours, maybe in a virtual machine, run it up, and you can play with a proper industrial scale firewall all by yourself for free. And who knows, maybe one day it's the one that you might be using for work purposes. So thanks for listening, everybody. Stay secure, and remember that work network, you don't have to be a technical expert. But it really helps if you put in a little bit of effort to prepare and to know what to expect. Because that way, if something does go wrong, you won't be running around trying to fix it after it's happened. So hope to see you next week. And until next time, stay secure.